I'm the Executive Director for Healthy Places by Design. I want you to note that this webinar is being recorded and the recording will be available to you and the public. And now I'd like to introduce you to my colleagues from Healthy Places by Design. Joanne Lee, our Senior Project Director, will be facilitating our Q&A during the webinar and leading the discussion group that follows immediately at 4 o'clock. And we hope you all join us for that. And our Project and Events Coordinator, Becky Snyderman, will be available to answer any tech questions you have along the way. So thank you to Joanne and Becky. Now let's get to know you. If you could, use the chat function and select everyone in the drop-down box and tell us what your name is and where you're joining us from. We look forward to checking that out and seeing that where folks are coming from, folks registered from all across the country. So we're very excited. Before we get started, I'd like to ask for your help in creating an engaging and welcoming atmosphere. So please do use the chat box along the way, add any comments, appreciations, and any related resources you think would be helpful to the conversation in chat. Note that if you do find that distracting, you can close chat and turn off notifications. For questions, we would like for you to use the Q&A box and not the chat. That helps us to more easily sort and track questions for the Q&A time and also for the discussion group at the end. Closed captions are available, and yes, you will receive the recording and the slides. In fact, by joining today, you'll be among the first to receive them. If you need any help with any of these options, please chat Becky directly and she can help. Healthy Places by Design's Socially Connected Communities Network builds and supports a movement to advance action that results in more socially connected and equitable communities. Our network has 4 components, each enable you to opt in based on your individual and community needs. Bi-monthly webinars are for learning. That's where you are now. And we'll share a schedule at the end of the webinar for upcoming webinars. We hope that you mark your calendars for those. Discussion groups deepen the learning, and they immediately follow every webinar for attendees to share and brainstorm with our guest presenters and with each other. We will chat out the link to join today's discussion group at the end of the webinar. Resource guides help you move to action, and we're going to send that resource, the one for today, out within a week. So be on the look for that. And then we also will be holding peer connections for networking across affinity areas. Our first group will be for those who are part of coalitions or groups that have social connection as a focus. The first meeting will be on Wednesday, April 10th at 4 p.m., and you'll get information about registration very soon. Now, before we begin, we would love to learn just a little bit more from you. Where are you in your socially connected journey? So we're going to launch a quick poll and ask you to select one of these 4 options. Are you beginning to learn and discuss the issue with others in your community? Are you and your organization ready to move to implementing strategies in your community? Are you already implementing socially connected strategies in your community and looking to deepen your work? Or have you been implementing social connection strategies in your community and have experiences or insights to share? We'll give just a few minutes or less, not a few minutes, but a little bit of time here for a few more of you to participate in the poll. This is really helpful to give us a little sense of who's with us, and over time, kind of how is this journey progressing. So about 10 more seconds, please go ahead and enter your answer, and then we'll close the poll. It's pretty equally spread. So thank you very much for participating in that. I want to continue on now. We are in for a treat today. We are diving into the intersection of economic health and social connection. Some of you that have eagle eyes may have noticed on our first slide that we've changed the title from what we originally had, because our panelists are going to share their wisdom and insights about why an economy centered around health and well-being for all can strengthen social health, and why that logic matters, which way it goes first. I'm very excited again about this conversation. We're going to start with presentations, move to Q&A toward the end of the hour, and again at 4 p.m., as you'll note on the next slide, we're going to move to our discussion group. Don't forget to join, save that time if you can. And again, the link will be given out to you at the very end of the webinar so that we can all join at the same time. And now, without any further ado, it is my pleasure to welcome our colleagues and friends from New America and the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. Elizabeth Garlow has worked for more than a decade to foster an economy that better supports flourishing. She's focused on investment and microfinance and on policy design and implementation strategies for a well-being economy. As a former policy advisor to the Obama administration, she helped develop the Community Solutions Task Force to foster federal government funding and practices that supported the priorities of local places. Elizabeth also helps strengthen the role of faith and spiritual leaders in shaping a new economy. Welcome, Elizabeth. And Amanda Janoo is an economic policy expert with more than a decade of experience working with governments and international development institutions. Her work aims to build just and sustainable economies through well-being oriented and participatory policy design processes. The Wellbeing Economy Alliance, or WEALL, is a collaboration of organizations, governments, movements, and change makers committed to designing economies that work in service of people and planet. Prior to joining WEALL, Amanda worked for the United Nations and the African Development Bank as an industrial policy and economic systems change expert. Welcome, Amanda. I'm delighted that you're both here. So let's get started. Elizabeth, the first question is for you. What is the current narrative of the economy and why is it not working for our health and well-being?
Thanks, Risa. It's such a pleasure to be here and also to be doing this with my dear friend and colleague, Amanda. When I ask people what comes to mind when you hear this term economy, I often get some similar responses like, oh, money, my job, the stock market. And I think what that points to is actually it helps expose some of the problems with our status quo understanding of the economy and the ways that it is contributing to a sense of isolation, a sense of disconnection. And I think what we're hoping to do today is to really reflect on some of the green shoots of a different vision for the economy and how we actually might shape it to better foster and enhance social connection. So I'm not surprised by those answers I get about what people think the economy is, because for the most part, here in the US, we have measured how well our economy is doing by whether gross domestic product, unemployment, or inflation are up or down. And these indicators and what they point to sort of fail to capture this more holistic vision of the economy, what it really is for, what it can be for. And that's part of why we flipped the title. So often we talk about what's good for the economy rather than how we build an economy that's good for us. So when policy making is based on this kind of inadequate set of metrics, we tend to ignore a lot of factors that influence our connection and well-being, like our ability to work in good quality jobs, our time spent in nature, our ability to access care, infrastructure, and supports, our sense of belonging to place and with each other. And on a personal or household level, I've been really interested in how we often talk about our economic success as measured by our level of income, our financial wealth. And I think this is a reflection of this broader narrative that says if we're doing well, that means we're growing our financial wealth. And in this system, we live according to this mythology, this story that says no amount of financial wealth is ever enough. And, it's a bit ironic actually, because the old English translation of the term wealth, Wayloth, actually means the conditions for well-being. So what is this broader, more comprehensive vision of wealth that we want to start to grapple with? And the quality of connection in our lives, as we all know very well, is a major contributor to that genuine wealth, that well-being, alongside adequate financial resources. So, in this jargon-ridden world of GDP growth rates, stock market values, like we heard a lot about during the pandemic. Oh, the stock market is succeeding, but we clearly knew we were at a peak of suffering. So there's clearly a disconnect there. And we're told that the economy is doing well if it's growing, if the stock market is up, if we're able to consume more. But that narrative, my point here is that narrative neglects the many ways that we are already producing and providing for one another, especially the work of caring for one another, providing many of the core services that uphold our day-to-day lives and our communities. And it's our skills, our gifts, our labor, both paid and unpaid, our volunteering, our innovations, our votes, our advocacy that really do shape our economy and support thriving families and connections. Um, Economist Tim Jackson once asked an audience, Amanda told me this story and I just love it. He asked an audience to imagine a group of new mothers sitting in a circle with their infants. And in today's kind of status quo economy, the only way we would capture value is if each mother passed her child off to someone else in the circle and then paid them for time spent holding their infant. And as the parent of a toddler, I often find this sort of mind boggling. It's a basic example, but it gets at the heart of the fact that many of the activities that hold our lives together and that strengthen our connection with one another are overlooked, undervalued in today's economic paradigm. And it kind of neglects this important work of nourishing the many contributions to our actual thriving, right? Like social connections. So, in today's system, the value of that time spent nurturing relationships with our infants and with other peers in our community would not be counted for, wouldn't be accounted or seen as contributing to the economy. So in the work that I've done with low-income families with young kids, I'm always struck by their desire to help other community members, friends, family, even casual acquaintances, whether it's with childcare or various kinds of resources. And that desire is often coupled with this heavy sense of burden because they already feel overtaxed because of lack of sufficient time and resources. So I think this is something we really need to pay attention to. As we strive to navigate the many crises that we're grappling with, it can be frustrating to see our policymakers continue to promote economic growth above everything else so that they can tax some of that wealth generated by that process to fix damages that are done to communities, to our planet in the process. But we know this approach isn't working. And there is actually a growing sense of dissatisfaction around that. And much of that dissatisfaction is driven by the immense inequalities in our society. We know that 8 people now own more wealth than half of humanity on our planet. And also this growing sense of loneliness, alienation, despair that's spreading not just in the United States, but throughout the world. We know that depression has now become the leading cause of disability worldwide. So the injustices of this current system that we're grappling with um, is a major contributor to issues of disconnection and the distrust that is growing in government and in institutions more broadly to make things better.
Wow, thank you, Elizabeth. I'm struck too by the fact that the original meaning of the word wealth is really conditions for well-being. So we see that that's not working. What's the alternative? Amanda, what is a well-being economy and what are its principles?
Mm, yeah. So really the well-being economy is a movement, and it's a movement that is in direct recognition of so many of the challenges that Elizabeth just raised. And so in the United States, which is, we would say the dominant paradigm is so powerful. The reality is that the majority of people recognize that our current economic system really needs to be fundamentally transformed. But beyond just recognizing the need for change, they also have articulated what change is necessary. So, with 68% of people believing that we should have an economy that is designed to directly support the health and well being of people in nature, as opposed to its current design, which is focused on profits and wealth. And this realization is really at the heart of the well-being economy movement. And so this movement comes under a lot of different banners, right? Like solidarity economy, circular economy, business for the common good, many, many more. But at its heart is this recognition that we have to stop treating people and planet like they're here to serve the economy and start treating the economy like it's here to serve us. And as intuitive as that may seem, this isn't a small shift because we've elevated the economy for so long that even, as Risa was saying, in the beginning, we still felt the need to make the case for why social connectedness is good for the economy, as opposed to feeling like we can swap that burden of proof and actually say, how would we evaluate the economy in terms of its contribution to our social connection, which is obviously a higher level good or importance. And so in recent decades, I think we've done a really good job of trying to elevate the importance of the social and the environmental to the level of the economic, and to say, look, society and the environment matter as well, and to try to illustrate how there might be co-benefits between those different spheres. But the issue is just that they're not commensurate, right? So the economy is just an aspect of our societies that are all embedded within a larger ecosystem. And so we need to be really evaluating our economy not by how quickly it's able to grow, but by its contribution to our societies and our larger environment. And so there's a lot of definitions of what matters, what really matters for society and the environment's well-being. But at least at WEAll, the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, we talk about these 5 needs, or the sort of 5 core principles or questions by which we can evaluate our economy's success. Namely, does our economy deliver on our fundamental needs for dignity, fairness, nature, participation, and connection? And so the first principle is of a well-being economy is that it would ensure that everyone has enough to live a life of comfort, safety, and happiness. And so the question becomes, does our economy ensure that everyone has the necessary foundations to live a life of dignity and purpose? And as Elizabeth was saying, I mean, it's a great irony that we're supposedly the richest country in the world, and yet the vast majority of people feel really insecure every single day in terms of meeting their basic needs. And so this is why we're seeing nationwide growing movements around universal basic income, universal basic services, economic human rights, that are all really trying to advocate for ensuring that all people, regardless of their effort, capacity, gender, race, etc., have those necessary foundations to live a life of comfort, dignity, and purpose. And then the second sort of principle is really centered in whether or not the well-being economy, it's related to nature. So whether or not the well-being economy can ensure a restored and safe natural world for all life. And so we have to ask ourselves whether our economy is protecting, cherishing, and regenerating the ecosystems that sustain us. And, again, the answer to this one would be resounding no in the US, as we ourselves our economy accounts for a quarter of all global greenhouse gas emissions, right? So our sort of relationship to the natural world currently is a bit problematic. But the good news, again, is that once we prioritize genuinely the well-being of our ecosystems and of all life, we have the capacity to build regenerative and circular economic systems that respect and give back to the earth as much as we take. The third principle is really centered in our need for fairness. And so the question is whether our economy ensures a just distribution of time, wealth, power, and voice. And so as Elizabeth was mentioning earlier, I think the dominant economic logic in the US continues to be, we got to grow the economy as quickly as possible, and either trust that it's somehow going to magically trickle down, or trust that the government can take some of that wealth through taxes to fix and redistribute and ensure more equitable outcomes. But there is a third way. Yeah. And so the third option is that we can actually move upstream and think about supporting the kind of economic activities that are going to ensure a more equitable distribution of wealth from the get-go. And so particularly at the grassroots level in the US, I think we're seeing a really rapidly accelerating solidarity economy movement that is really centered in supporting cooperatives, for example, community land trusts, like alternative forms of ownership that can ensure more equitable distribution within the economy, and centering of fairness. And then the fourth principle, I believe, is really critically important, and that's around participation. As our current economic system has really supported and been led by a process of corporate globalization that has left people feeling like they don't have any voice or power over their individual fates, let alone our collective destiny. And so I don't know if you've spoken with any young people lately, but the level of deep nihilism and despair is really palpable. And so we really need to focus on developing avenues for people to directly engage in being able to redesign our economy through initiatives like citizens' assemblies, deliberative democracy, co-governance, so that, yeah, we truly feel that our economies are a reflection of our values and priorities. And then the last, but certainly not least, is the principle of connection and the topic of our discussion today. And so the goal of a well-being economy would be to have an economy that fosters a true sense of belonging and trust in one another and in the institutions that we're a part of. And so the question is, does our economy genuinely foster meaningful connections and right relationships? And so it's important to be clear that an economy, by its very definition, is always going to be a system of social connection, because it connects and binds us through all of these intricate networks of production and exchange. But clearly, the epidemic of loneliness is illustrating that something about the way that the economy is connecting us is not fostering the depth of genuine belonging and the sort of human spiritual aspects that we need in order to feel like that connection is really nourishing. And so there's a lot of different dynamics at play in the economy that are driving this isolation. But it's important to remember that, first of all, mainstream economics, like neoclassical economics, the fundamental assumption in it is that we're all inherently individualistic, competitive, rational, selfish actors. And that somehow this is a good thing. Okay. And so the belief is that everybody taking as much as they can for themselves is somehow going to make everybody better off. And now any child, right, will sort of get that that doesn't make sense intuitively, but it has somehow come to be the dominant understanding that narrates our current system. And so we're learning, though, that although we conceptualize as if everybody being competitive and individualistic is a good thing, neuroscience is illustrating that actually we're very hardwired to want to give and share with one another, as the action of giving functions to reduce our stress levels, boost our immune systems, and reinforce social trust. In fact, this is just a little interesting tip, is one of the quickest ways to get somebody to trust you is to ask them for a favor. Yeah, because the act of them actually giving you something makes them trust you more. That's how deep it is. But in the converse, a market-based transaction, which, now fills almost all of our lives, it seems so benign, actually functions to do the opposite. So meaning that it increases our stress levels, suppresses our immune systems, and reinforces social distrust. And the thing is that the growth imperative that Elizabeth was speaking about in our current system requires us to increasingly isolate from one another and minimize how much we share. So in the early 20th century, there was actually a moment where industries were concerned because they felt like they reached a level of production that everybody's needs were met. And so they went about investing heavily in the advertisement industry in order to convince every person that they needed to have their own car, their own house, their own blender, their own lawnmower, etc., right? So that there could be this continuous increasing in demand. And so in pretty much I've lived abroad for a long time, every country that I've lived in, most people spend their time outside in sort of public spaces. But here in the US, we tend to want to ensure that every possible luxury and comfort is in our own home, so that we don't need to go out into shared spaces or to rely on other people to borrow things that we may need once or twice. And so we've removed a lot of the just practical mechanisms and opportunities to develop this reliance that is really important for social connection. And I just want to say that furthermore, I'm not exactly sure when we allowed Amazon to take over our entire economy and society, but even that market-based transaction no longer even requires the smallest amount of human interaction. And so we have all of these goods that are being delivered directly to our door, made by people millions of miles away that we have no solidarity or kinship with, as we sit in our cars and houses alone. And then we find that our system continues to be able to find new innovative ways to profit on our loneliness and to commodify our attention through technological apps and marketplaces, right? And so I know that the research around social connection is fairly new, and this is why this particular topic I've been so excited to speak about with you all. But we were actually, Elizabeth and I had a chat with Eddie Garcia, who I think is here and is like an expert in sort of social connection research and advocacy. And we weren't surprised when he said that one of the most effective strategies that they found thus far to combat loneliness is volunteering, because there you have brings us back to those non-monetary ways that we can directly interact with one another that is so critical for meaningful connection.
Thank you, Amanda. This is so fascinating. And I know when I heard the Amazon example, it just clicked. Remember when we would go in and you'd form a relationship with a barista or whatever, some we still do, but at a much lower level, right? So I love these examples. It is becoming more and more clear how a well-being economy supports social connection. But Elizabeth, can you go a little deeper on this idea for us on how we can redesign our economies to support greater social connection?
Sure. Amanda's reminding me of a story. 5 years ago, I tried to run an experiment for 3 months where I didn't participate in any automated transaction and would like go into the bank and see the teller face to face. And I don't know if I could even do that anymore. Right? I think it's getting harder and harder to foster this kind of connection. But I remember what animated that experiment to begin with was this recognition that I had a deep longing for connection and interaction throughout of many forms throughout my day. And I think that kind of points to this sort of mindset shift that I really think we need to start with in our society broadly. We won't really arrive at a way of redesigning our economy without this kind of change of mind and heart. We've inherited a lot of stories about a good life in our culture, and it's really tied up with consumerism and luxury. And we've been told that, participating in an economic story like what Amanda described as individuals pursuing our self-interest is how we're going to get to that good life. So we really have to rewrite the stories that animate how we think about the economy and our lives in that economy. So, and this is why I think participation, these principles of participation matter so much, right? How often are we given opportunities to really reflect and discern both individually and together about what really matters to us for having a good life? At a personal level, we know, and I think Amanda spoke to this a little bit, we know that generosity and giving of our time and resources is strongly correlated with happiness. There is existing neurological research that shows that gift giving boosts our immune systems, it reduces cortisol, it reinforces social trust. And our status quo economic logic actually encourages the opposite in many ways. And so we have to really call that into question. At a sort of macro societal level, we know that shared prosperity is not going to happen in a divided economy where we're experiencing these growing inequalities of wages and persistent issues with job security. So I often argue we really need a moral revolution. We kind of need a new morality to guide our thinking around the redesign of the economy. Some people would say, we need a new set of myths that moves away from that kind of individual self-interested rational actor and those stories that embrace the messy humanness, the emotional humanness that we all are made up of. And so some of the kind of widely embraced values other than financial wealth maximization that I see beginning to play a more prominent role in how we think about the purposes of an economy are here listed on this slide. And I think this is about building a system that is more responsive to our needs and voices. So these are values like sustainability and real care and reverence for the earth, community and connection, our ability to care for one another, which is so essential to a good life. Inclusion, so really embracing those that have been excluded from the status quo system. And I really believe we have to think about how we are going to reckon with those legacies of harm in order to actually move forward and redesign a different system. So how can we have an openness to discussions around reparations, damage loss payments, things that will actually help us do that well. So often economists are trained, and I had this training myself, we are trained to focus on efficiency. We actually get very little training about the ends of economics or the real meaning of well-being. Often efficiency is sort of the North Star that's held up, and then equity is left to the others. But it's not working. And we need to acknowledge that these kinds of moral values that are listed here are actually self-evident. They do not need to be justified by how they contribute to efficiency. And that is an argument I am, consistently making. So how do we shift toward honoring and building a sense of accountability to social and ecological outcomes, and the principles that Amanda was describing alongside the sort of financial outcomes that we've had an outsized focus on? I think this does begin with really empowering the voices of many people, especially in forms of governance. So if we think, for example, about movements toward worker co-determination, so worker representation on corporate boards, I think that plays a significant role. And I think it also means moving away from this idea of maximum extraction for oneself to participating in forms of broadly held ownership and stewardship for the whole. So building common infrastructure around water and health and land and other assets that are under public sector or community control and governance. This is often referred to in the literature as the democratic economy. And there are a lot of expressions of this popping up in communities around the US. So hopefully we'll have some time to dig into that in our discussion section. But, for example, some of you may be familiar with what's happened in Cleveland, Ohio with the Evergreen Cooperative System. It's looking at this combination of democratically owned firms, often combined with some sort of public banking infrastructure, land trusts, some of these things that fall under, as Amanda was describing, the solidarity economy umbrella. And I think these expressions of democratic ownership and governance are very tied with enhancing social connection. We haven't had a very robust conversation around that, actually, but I think it's time. I'm excited about that. These kinds of firms, these economic structures offer pathways for practicing democracy in our workplaces, in our civic lives. They grow a sense of agency and civic muscle, and also our sense of belonging and our accountability to something greater than ourselves. So I think this also opens us up to consider commons forms of economic structures. For those who aren't really familiar with commons or commoning, it's really about, it's used to describe resources that are held in common. So like I imagine many of you working in your communities, things like third spaces in our built environment where residents might come together to care for and use a community space. So the time and resources to really invest in and care for these commons is not something we've really designed into our economic system, for example, but it could be. Similarly, Amanda mentioned volunteerism. I just wanted to share, I am recently back from traveling in Hawaii with my family. I was there visiting with this incredible coalition called the Aina Aloha Economic Futures Coalition that is enacting transformative economic visions and strategies for the islands there to reduce reliance on tourism and extractive industry. And while I was there, I spent a day volunteering on a taro farm that relies on committed volunteers each week to come and clean the taro and to make this nutritious ancestral food available in affordable ways for elders in the community. And while we were doing that, we swapped stories with other volunteers. And I think there was just this deep, abiding sense of care and connection that emerged in that space, which felt very, very special.
Love that story. And these examples are amazing. Great examples of how this can really look. Amanda, where are we seeing a broader movement for well-being economy in action?
So I'll start by just saying calls for economic systems change are obviously not new, but I do think that something happened after the global financial crisis where sort of unlocked our imaginations and increased a lot more interest in sort of new economic thinking. And then with COVID, that's when I feel like we've seen a massive acceleration in the well-being economy movement at all levels. And so I work for a global organization. So I'm going to start at the globe, and then we'll work our way, from the global to the local of the ways in which we're seeing this manifest. And so in the public health realm, one of the ways in which we've been seeing this globally is the WHO themselves ended up having a well-being economy campaign. And I'm honest with you, I do think it sort of fell back a little bit on more of that traditional logic of making the case for why health is good for the economy as a way of then legitimizing or trying to advocate for more resources being allocated by government to healthcare, rather than making the case for if we change the economy, we could reduce healthcare costs altogether by having happier and healthier societies, right? But I think I do find hope in the newer commercial determinants of health work that's been coming out, as it's heading in that direction, as it's explicitly focusing and identifying how financialization, privatization, concentration of industries in our economy is directly resulting on these negative health outcomes. But I'll just say that it's not just public health, like people and globally are coming from all these different sort of starting points: environmental, mental health, racial equity, et cetera. And Greenpeace is even going to have a well-being economy campaign this coming year, for example. And then at the national level, governments, which, let's be honest, are not always our swiftest of movers, seem to be waking up to this sort of concept and realization as well, with Jacinda Ardern explicitly stating, right, that we can no longer make the case that economic growth accompanied by all of these worsening social outcomes is somehow success, but recognize that changing things around was going to require us to really think differently, to act differently, and to take different ways of measuring success. And so she was really quite true to her word, in the sense that New Zealand became one of the founding members of the Wellbeing Economy Governments Partnership. And so this informal partnership of countries, they have all committed to the notion of advancing a well-being economy and have developed alternative indicators to GDP by which to assess their national progress on the basis of social and ecological well-being. And so the exact shape and form of these national frameworks we could get into, they differ, but ultimately, I'm pretty sure every single one of them does include some high-level indicator and dimension related to social connection, trust, and belonging. So that comes up and is clearly one of the major orientation points for the definition of well-being. And so out of these countries, my favorite has to be Wales, as they went through this process of asking their citizens, what kind of Wales do you want to leave for your children and grandchildren? And on this basis, they articulated these 7 long-term well-being goals, which ultimately became enshrined. They're the ones that are the pieces of that circle up there, in legislation called the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. And what this did was that it required government to take a long-term perspective to decision-making, to establish clear 25-year goals related to and targets related to all of those 7 dimensions, to establish clear indicators that could assess progress and to look at sort of foresight. But critically, it also involved requiring these 5 ways of working or fundamental reforms in the way that governance and decision-making happen. And so it wasn't just about taking that longer term perspective, but also requiring government to take a preventative mindset. Because currently we're sort of used to government just being here to put out fires when it happens, as opposed to trying to prevent those crises from coming around in the first place. And really critically, this emphasis on integration and collaboration, what it said was that now all agencies are collectively responsible for the achievement of these 7 goals. So the health ministry is not responsible for a healthier Wales solely. All ministries have to consider how their activities would ultimately contribute to a healthier Wales. And so one example of what this ended up looking like in practice was that they had a proposal for a large new highway or motorway, as they call it, to go through a nature reserve in Wales. And they had to go through the process of making the case for how it would contribute to all 7 of these goals. They couldn't make the case for contributing to any of the goals, actually, except for maybe part of one. And so they ultimately ended up putting a freeze on any new public infrastructure spending for the next, I can't remember if it was 3 or 5 years, so that all of that budget would be directed towards public transportation and active travel instead, which they could see as directly contributing to a healthier, more equal, globally responsible Wales, etc. Right? And so this kind of really transformative thinking around governance and holistic sort of measurement and conceptions of well-being is also, we're starting to see this in the US as well. And so Washington State, I see as one of the really exciting examples where they began by engaging citizens in a dialogue about what matters most for well-being. And through that, they recognized that the greatest threats were clearly related to the environmental crisis, inequality, and poverty. And so have been going through a process of redefining and measuring well-being and recognizing that actually what this requires is a fundamental transformation in the governance and decision-making itself. And so they're really trying to work to center lived experience to bring together a diverse range of stakeholders. And very excitingly, just a couple weeks ago, they officially now have $2 million in the state budget that is going to be going for community assemblies, which are when you bring together a group. I don't know, it's normally 100 globally, but I don't know exactly how many it's going to be in Washington, to discuss the economic and environmental justice for the state and identify strategies and policies for identifying it. And so now, obviously not everywhere in the US is going to have sort of this level of political will to advance this work. But I think what we're seeing is more and more coalitions forming, movements building, and society really calling for new visions of progress, really centered in social and ecological well-being. And so Elizabeth and I actually are going to be bringing together a bunch of coalitions in DC next month to really learn more about all of these activities. But in Hawaii and Alaska, for example, the Aina Aloha Economics Futures Initiative and the Just Transition Alaska Coalition are both advocating for economic systems change, but really centering Indigenous values and economic practices, which are based in traditional methods of gift giving, of ecological restoration and stewardship practices, and balancing that also with, renewable energy and other kinds of strategies, but really developing quite visionary and holistic initiatives to not just confront the challenges of the day, but to genuinely work towards like a better future that we can envision. And so in Vermont, I'm part of a coalition that is building a movement to try to pass something similar to the Wales Future Generations Act in our state. And so I know that we're, a small, sort of humble state, but what we also want to do is to ensure that we're able to amplify the pieces of a well-being economy that already exists and that we see around us. So like the cooperatives that are employee-owned businesses that are ensuring a more equitable distribution of wealth, the regenerative farmers that are healing our lands, our town meetings where people come together and directly sort of deliberate on town policies and practices. And really importantly, the sort of hidden random acts of kindness and generosity that keep our world turning. So for example, in like my small town, everyone leaves candy at the general store for all of the houses that are on the one main street where kids go and trick or treat every year, right? Like these are just small things that exist in spite of, not because of our current system, but I believe hold the blueprints for this better world and alternative economic system that we can envision. And so there's many more state and local initiatives blossoming all across the US. And so I hope you'll join these movements, bring your own unique vision, wisdom, experience, and gifts to those transformative efforts. But if nothing else, I do hope that you'll take away from this webinar is a reminder that we are the economy, Yeah. And therefore, we have a right and responsibility to change it so that it truly supports our health and well-being now and for generations to come. Thanks.
Wow. Thank you both. What a phenomenal start to the conversation. And this whole topic is so interesting and multi-layered. I'm sure we could go on forever on some Q&A, but I'm going to turn it over to Joanne, who's been monitoring our Q&A box to lead us into some questions now.
Thank you. Yes, I echo the thanks to Amanda and Elizabeth. It's clear that folks are really engaged and interested in this topic, and you did such a wonderful job first, really prompting us to change our mindsets ourselves, and then outlining potential solutions and approaches, and even giving some great examples. So I'm going to get into the questions right away. Great examples again, and I think folks are curious about what policies would you recommend are the priority policies at the intersection of social and economic health, particularly at the local level for our community practitioners that are operating in their local communities?
I'll start with a few reflections, and it's also really fun to see the chat unfolding here. Yeah, I mean, a couple things come to mind. So one is the growing and important focus on direct cash assistance as a way to alleviate some of the just tremendous pressures that exist on families in an era of insufficient wages. And so I think, for example, what's happening just north of me in Flint, Michigan right now, it's a really important cash assistance pilot for pregnant mothers. I think 800 mothers to start who will be a part of this pilot, and understanding over time the ways that reducing some of the sort of burdens on individuals can also give them, of course, make dramatic leaps and improvements in health, but also free them up to be more connected in their communities and with their families and with their loved ones and be able to care more. Where Amanda mentioned the work that's happening in Washington State, and the work around transforming economic strategies actually is on the heels of a 10-year plan that they developed around poverty reduction across the state, which also had deeply participatory elements in it. And as they talked to citizens, they heard over and over again how much connection with their neighbors really mattered and how much they would love to help even more if they had access to more resources. And so I think there are ways in which cash assistance, has meaningful reach kind of beyond just alleviating near-term needs. It also might have ripple effects beyond that. So I think there's some interesting research, and there are various expressions of that, right? Baby bonds and the work Derek Hamilton is doing is a very interesting policy proposal. Universal basic income or kind of guaranteed cash. Another thing, I think, just kind of building on what we were talking about in terms of the democratic economy, is thinking about the incentives that could be put into place to make cooperative structures or employee ownership a friendlier path for people who are starting a business. Anyone who's getting a business off the ground takes a huge amount of risk on. And the Small Business Administration and the sort of various regional offices we have just don't have robust infrastructure in place to really provide preferential access to financing and other forms of technical assistance. The U.S. Department of Agriculture has funded kind of cooperative economic development centers, but at a local level, I think there's just a huge amount of opportunity right now to really look at that issue, especially with this, what we call the silver tsunami, retiring baby boomer business owners who are going to be selling their companies. Will they sell them to private equity, or could they sell them to their employees? Could they sell them to residents in the community? So
Great.
those are a couple of things I'd mention.
Yeah, great. I'm wondering, Amanda, if you want to jump in on this, but I do have another question in the queue too.
Sure. Yeah, maybe just building on what Elizabeth said. I think for me, a lot of times it's less about the individual policies, it's sort of the process, right? And so I think starting out, no matter the size of the community, really going through a process of deliberation with community members to articulate that well-being vision is a really important just starting point. So that it's articulated in their own language that feels owned and understood. Because like 9 times out of 10, when you ask people what they love about where they live, it's the people and the nature in some way, right? And then then it becomes a question, why aren't those the things by which we're evaluating our success around then, right? And so that's part of where, once you have that articulation of like what people really think matters most, and sometimes framing it as children's well-being, what's important for children's well-being is helpful because it expands our imaginations to recognize that play and time and love and these sort of things are also important, not just like the direct materialistic things. But to go through that process, articulate that vision, and then really set clear goals for yourself, because a lot of times still we tend to measure output, like how many houses are we building, not is everybody housed, right? Like, and so there's a difference in terms of what we're ultimately measuring, and then therefore what the strategy is for how we go about developing it. So I think that would be like the first step I would suggest for any community.
Really helpful, and just the refocus that you both are continuing to encourage us to focus on relationships, not necessarily be less transactional in many ways, right? And so, Amanda, you provided a really nice segue to the second question, and folks are already thinking about how so much of this is a narrative shift. It requires a narrative shift and mindset shifts. And our wise audience members are thinking, well, we got to get the kids when they're young and before they even shape these more harmful or challenging mindsets. And so one of our attendees wants to hear your thoughts about, do you have any examples or ideas of how we can begin teaching this well-being economy concept, like at an early elementary, middle school age?
Do you want to take it first, Elizabeth? Just spoke, so.
So I'm based here in Detroit, and I've been very influenced by the Boggs Center, Grace Lee Boggs Center for Social Justice, which has developed an elementary school here that is really working on engaging the arts, music, and time spent outside in urban gardens, kind of cultivating a new food ecosystem as the most sort of proximate, tangible way of experiencing a new economy in action. And having spent time with kids in these gardens just gives me hope that more sort of embodied experiences like that would go a very long way.
Yeah, so maybe integrating it into school curriculum would be a strategy. Other thoughts on this, Amanda?
Yeah, I was just trying to look actually. So again, coming back to Wales. So as a result of this comprehensive sort of well-being legislation, I think a similar train of thought started, right? Which is, how do we really build the capacities for people to genuinely foster meaningful connections and right relationships with one another in the natural environment. And so they've been on a process of total educational reform to really focus a lot on learning skills of like ecological restoration and connection, as well as more emotional intelligence, not just like content intelligence of like how do we interact with one another in ways that can ensure generative and connective dynamics. And so there's examples of that happening. I think in the United States, of course, there are a lot of like sort of alternative educational, probably like curriculum and initiatives that are there, but I would love to see more of this. And I also just think that children and young people are really struggling, so I think there's just more of a need for us all to spend more time being with young people right now, and to actually think about that question that we're going to share, because it's an important one. Like, how do we help to bring a little hope and to share our wisdom and experiences around this?
Absolutely. And some of the examples that you both shared about to help us make the connections between the economy and social connections, things like civics classes, right? Or volunteer after school programs, and perhaps it's just better making a tie about how this can change the way we approach the economy. Could be good strategies too. Wonderful. Well, I'm so glad we have the post-webinar discussion group where we can continue our conversation with you, and audience members can come and ask more questions and also share what they're doing. So I know we have a few more things that we want to share with our audience before we end the webinar. So we'll turn it back to Risa.
Thank you, Joanne, and thank you again, Amanda and Elizabeth. This is just such an exciting conversation. We are thrilled to let you know about our next Socially Connected Communities Network webinar and discussion group, where the topic is going to be exploring the intersection of civic, social, and community health. And I can already see strong ties between this conversation and that conversation. It will feature guests Anita Chandra from RAND and Michael Stevenson with County Health Rankings and Roadmaps. So you can register now using the link in the chat. We'll send another reminder out as well later for you, and please mark your calendar to join the post-webinar discussion group after that webinar as well, from 4 to 5 p.m. We also want you to know we've got a whole list of topics coming up that we've been articulating, and you can see these on the screen as registration information becomes available. We'll send them to you, but we encourage you to invite anyone you think may benefit to our webinars. They are open to anyone interested in this topic, and we love growing the network. Because you are here today, you will receive an early release of the webinar slide deck and recording, as well as a resource guide from today's webinar. So be on the lookout to receive those within the week. We'll disseminate these materials about social connection and economic health, or flip-flop, economic health and social connection, more broadly on our website next month as well. And then finally, our first peer connection will take place on Wednesday, April 10th at 4 p.m. Eastern, and it's specifically for people who are part of coalitions that are focused on addressing social connection. So be on the lookout for that opportunity as well. We want to close the webinar and segue into the discussion group momentarily, but we'd love to hear from you about one thing here before we go. We're going to launch a poll, and we'd love to know if you gained new insights or learnings by attending today's webinar. This is one way that we are tracking whether or not, we're offering you what we hope you find valuable. So please answer that response for us, and then we'll be able to move in to that. In addition, we welcome you to put anything in the chat that would be helpful as far as what you might find that intriguing issue or topic area related to socially connected communities you'd like to learn more about. We'll be looking at your answers to help us inform future conversations as well. We're going to close the poll, and that was 100% yes, by the way, Amanda and Elizabeth. Everyone learned something new here, so that's super great to hear. And now we go ahead and we're inviting you to join us in the discussion group. The next slide is just reminding us that that's starting immediately now, and there is a link in the chat for you to join us, and we hope we see many of you there so we can continue this conversation. Again, Amanda and Elizabeth, thank you so much for sharing this rich information. We will see you momentarily as well. Thanks, everyone.